The year was 1985, a year etched in the annals of a divided world. The Cold War was at its simmering peak, a chessboard where superpowers stared each other down with steely determination. Walls were not just made of concrete, they were psychological, ideological, and cultural. And yet, in the warmth of the Southern Hemisphere, a young man dreamed of crossing those barriers. David Miller, 23, born and bred in Melbourne, was many things: curious, idealistic, fiercely independent. But above all, he was restless. His friends often described him as a soul out of time, someone more likely to chase sunsets than settle for a 9-to-5. He devoured travel books, history journals, and back issues of National Geographic like they were sacred texts. But his fascination was peculiar, drawn not to the sun-soaked beaches of Spain or the romance of Paris, but to the iron-grey shadows of the Eastern Bloc.
"Why would you want to go there, mate?" his friend Rob had once asked over a lukewarm Carlton draught. "It's all bricks, boredom, and blokes in trench coats watching your every move."
But David had long been intrigued by the unknown. The stern photos of Politburo members, the grainy footage of May Day parades, the ghostly images of streets that looked frozen in time, these were not deterrents to him. They were invitations. In a world full of distractions, the East seemed sober, controlled, almost cinematic. In the narrow corner of a Melbourne cafe, sunlight slicing through wooden blinds, David traced his finger over a folded map of East Germany. It was well worn, creased at the folds and coffee-stained at the edges. A friend had loaned it to him, half as a joke, half as a warning.
"Stick to the authorized roads," his friend had said, chuckling nervously, "and don't let curiosity get you shot."
The words had stuck with David, though not in the way they were meant. To him, the idea of restrictions only added to the allure. He wanted to see what lay behind the curtain, not through the filtered lens of propaganda, but with his own eyes. He didn't know what he was hoping to find. Perhaps something noble, perhaps something sinister, or maybe just a glimpse into the lives of those shaped by an ideology so different from his own. By April, the decision was made. His savings, modest but sufficient, were allocated to the trip. His passport was inked, his Ford Fiesta prepped for the long journey across Europe. Australia would fade behind him like a half-remembered dream. Ahead lay the great unknown, a plunge into the cold, structured world of East Germany. As he boarded the ferry from Calais to the continent, David stood alone at the railing, the wind tugging at his jacket. Somewhere deep in his chest was a thrum of anticipation, and something else. A quiet, naive certainty that the world was full of meaning, if only one knew where to look. But meaning, like truth, often comes at a cost. Chapter 2. Into the heart of the DDR. The rolling green hills of West Germany gave way to something more solemn as David approached the East German border near Kassel. Gone were the friendly roadside cafes and billboards for holiday resorts. In their place stood thick forests, barbed wire fences, and monolithic watchtowers that clawed at the grey sky like relics of another time. Even the air seemed heavier, loaded with secrets. At the crossing, the atmosphere changed entirely. The chatter of Western travellers died in the throats of those ahead of him. Everything was orderly. No laughter, no casual waving, just grim faces and methodical checks. A world wrapped in protocol. David's Ford Fiesta rolled slowly to a halt at the checkpoint, its engine idling like a nervous breath. The uniformed man who stepped toward him looked as though he had been carved from the very stone of the bunker-like structure behind him.
"Passport and documents," he said, not as a question, but as a demand.
David handed them over with a slightly trembling hand. The guard, his face unreadable beneath a peaked cap, flipped through the papers slowly, pausing now and then with a slight narrowing of the eyes. His nameplate read, Oberfeldwebel M. Kirsch. There was something surgical about Kirsch's movements, calculated, precise, the result of countless drills and years of watching for threats in the mundane. David forced a polite smile, but it hung in the air like a misplaced photograph, completely out of context.
"Purpose of visit?" he asked in a clipped accent. "Tourism," David replied, trying not to sound rehearsed. "History, architecture."
Kirsch looked up for the first time, eyes narrowing further. Not suspicious, exactly, just curious in the way a falcon might eye a mouse with an unusual gait.
"Tourism from Australia alone a beat unusual." "I've always wanted to see it," David offered, then immediately wished he hadn't. It sounded childish, naive.
A silence followed that seemed to stretch longer than it had any right to. Then Kirsch stamped the papers hard and returned them.
Stay on authorized routes. No deviations, understand? Yes.
The boom gate rose slowly, creaking like an old theatre curtain revealing a stage no one was quite ready for. David drove on, past anti-tank barricades and armed sentries, each casting glances that were more than perfunctory. The first few kilometers into East Germany were like entering a dream, where everything familiar was altered. Trees stood straighter, buildings grimmer, and the road signs more austere. There were no billboards, no bright colors, just state slogans painted in bold reds on decaying concrete. But amid the concrete and quiet, there was also a strange sense of order. Life here functioned differently, not freer, but not collapsed either. People walked to and from tram stops, children played under the watchful eyes of party murals, and there was a rhythm to the repression. David tried to focus on the architecture, the prefabricated Plattenbau apartments, the soot-streaked statues of socialist heroes. He wanted to absorb everything, to understand what it meant to live in a society that viewed his world as a decadent threat. Yet, as the kilometers ticked by and the watchtowers shrank in his rearview mirror, David couldn't stop thinking about the border guard. Oberfeldwebel Kirsch had barely said a dozen words, and yet each one had seemed charged with meaning. What kind of life did a man like that lead? Did he believe in the cause? Or was he, like many, simply caught in a system too large to escape? David didn't know it yet, but Kirsch was not finished with him. Their paths would cross again, in a moment far more charged than a passport check. Chapter 3. The Stranger's Table. The town of Weimar, nestled quietly in the heart of East Germany, seemed a world away from the thunderous checkpoints and guarded roads David had just passed. Known for its literary heritage and classical architecture, Weimar was a place of poetry and politics, Goethe and Stalin. David had chosen it not for its significance, but for its charm, a place to pause, reflect, and maybe, just maybe, connect. He parked his Ford Fiesta near the town centre and wandered on foot, weaving through cobbled streets beneath the slow descent of an autumn sun. Statues of poets stood shoulder to shoulder with banners proclaiming worker solidarity. The past and the present stared at each other across alleys like wary siblings. David had hoped to sit among locals, taste their food, hear their stories. But the DDR had other ideas. He stepped into a modest restaurant whose wooden sign swung gently in the breeze. Inside, it was warm, dimly lit, with checkered tablecloths and the scent of roast pork drifting through the air. A few groups of East Germans sat in conversation, their voices low, their eyes sharp with awareness. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with a kind but weary expression, approached him quickly.
Guten Tag, table for one?
Yes, please, David replied with a smile, relieved to be off the road.
He gestured toward a seat near the window, where several patrons sat sipping beer and eating stew. But the waitress gently shook her head.
That table for citizens. You sit here. She gestured to a table near the kitchen, alone, out of earshot from everyone else.
It wasn't said cruelly, nor even with judgment, just firmly, as if this was the way things were. David nodded slowly and took the offered seat. He looked around the restaurant and realized every foreigner, there were 3 others, was seated in a similar spot. One near the bar, one in the corner, one beside the coat rack. The menu was in German, of course, but with enough high school vocabulary and educated guessing, David managed to order a simple meal. Rinderbraten mit Klößen, roast beef with dumplings. When the meal arrived, he placed several East German marks, the local currency, on the tray, neatly counted and accurate.
No. The waitress pushed them back gently. Do you have Westmarks or US dollars?
But this is legal tender, right? David asked, baffled. I exchanged it at the official rate.
Yes, she said, but it is not good here, not for you.
David's mind swam with questions. This wasn't black market behavior. It was open, accepted, expected. The East German mark might have existed on paper, but in practice it was worthless to anyone who could access hard currency. And foreigners? They were sources of Western wealth, not comrades. He handed over a crumpled $20 bill. The waitress smiled slightly for the first time, as if a secret code had been entered correctly. She returned a handful of West German marks as change, not East German marks, but the real ones, the ones people actually used. That night, David tried to speak with the locals at the bar, not out of arrogance, but because he wanted to understand. He asked polite questions about architecture, food, literature. Each time, the answers were clipped, guarded.
"You are from Australia?" one man asked without smiling. "Then you are lucky."
The statement hung in the air like smoke. Later, as David walked back to his modest Inter-hotel, a state-run hotel for foreigners, he noticed the people on the street never quite made eye contact. They didn't scowl, didn't frown, but avoided him the way one might avoid a mirror in poor lighting. He was an outsider in every possible way. He lay in his bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling. His assumptions about communism were already beginning to unravel. It wasn't the ideology that troubled him, it was the quiet dishonesty of it all. The two currencies, the two sets of rules, the two classes of people, those who could access the West, and those who couldn't even dream of it. He realized then that the Iron Curtain wasn't just a wall, it was a maze, and he had only begun to step inside. Chapter 4, The Weight of Silence. It was the small things that David began to notice first, details too subtle to appear in history books or travel guides, things no camera could properly capture. A mother pulling her child gently back when he ran too loudly across a street. A man holding his newspaper too close, glancing around before folding it. A waiter's forced neutrality when David asked a question that touched too near politics. There was no single moment of revelation. No stormtroopers kicking down doors, just silence and eyes. No one smiled, not a genuine smile, not in public. The laughter David heard was tight and calculated, too loud at times, as if to prove something, then extinguished too quickly. Even children seemed cautious, their play confined, hushed, without the reckless joy that spilled over in Melbourne's parks and streets. In the morning, David wandered Weimar's Market Square. It should have been idyllic. Narrow timber-framed houses, a gentle breeze, the smell of warm bread from a nearby bakery. But the market stalls felt scripted. Vendors greeted him with overly formal politeness, their voices measured. Behind them, men in drab uniforms loitered, police, maybe Stasi. They said nothing, just watched. David paused at a bookstall, thumbing through a copy of Brecht. The bookseller gave him a slight nod, but made no attempt to chat. David had expected discussions about literature, culture, art, but here, everything was transactional. Eyes down, voices low. He bought the book out of politeness and walked on, Brecht under his arm, feeling increasingly out of place. In his mind, communism had seemed like a stark yet romantic ideal, a society where people shared what they had, where materialism was tamed and equality reigned. But this wasn't a utopia of shared values. It was a cage of wary glances and unspoken rules. Outside a residential block, David watched a man fix his bicycle. The man worked efficiently, methodically, but when their eyes met, he froze. Not in fear exactly, just stillness. As if uncertain whether a stranger's gaze might be a question or a trap. David offered a nod, hoping to bridge the distance. The man hesitated, then returned the nod, slowly. No words were exchanged. It was in that brief, awkward exchange that David felt something deeper settle in him. Not anger, not even fear, just sadness. A sense that the human spirit, when caged too long, learned not just to obey, but to doubt its own instincts, to distrust kindness, to avoid being noticed. Back in his hotel room, David made himself a coffee from a travel tin and sat on the edge of the bed. The streets below looked peaceful, even beautiful in the afternoon light. But now he saw it all differently. The silence of the town was not peace, it was resignation. He decided to drive. He needed open roads, movement, space to breathe. The architecture, the books, the food, none of it mattered if the people inside those structures lived with invisible chains. He packed quickly and checked out of the Inter-hotel, exchanging a few more Westmarks with the clerk, who accepted them wordlessly and handed him a stamped receipt. No one asked where he was going. No one seemed to care. As he slid behind the wheel of the Fiesta, engine rumbling to life, David took one last look at the town. It was beautiful, in the way museums are beautiful, still preserved, solemn. He pulled onto the road without a destination in mind. He just wanted to drive. But the road, like the country, had secrets, and David was about to stumble into one. Chapter 5, A Hopeful Turn. The road stretched ahead in a pale ribbon, flanked by wind-stunted trees and endless fields of dying sunflowers. The day had turned grey, clouds settling low like a ceiling that threatened to crush the horizon. David gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. He had made a mistake. Not catastrophic, at least, not yet, but enough to send a current of unease crawling up his spine. Back in Weimar, the signs had been clear. Literally. He had followed the blue-marked tourist route, the one printed on the official maps given to foreigners. It was supposed to be foolproof. But sometime in the late afternoon, after missing a left-hand turn obscured by overgrown branches and an unmarked fork, he found himself somewhere not listed. He slowed the car to a crawl and pulled the map from the passenger seat, unfolding it across the steering wheel. He traced the roads with his finger, looking for landmarks. But the names on the signs didn't match anything on the paper. Some places weren't listed at all. There was a thin, red-marked path that might be the road he was on, an access road maybe, or one of the less-used secondary highways. It wasn't labelled as restricted, not explicitly. That comforted him for the moment.
"Just keep going," he muttered aloud. "It has to link back. Everything connects eventually."
The words felt hollow the moment they left his lips. He turned off the radio, which had been playing a strangely sentimental orchestral loop, state-approved music, no doubt. Silence returned, amplifying every small rattle in the car, every crunch of the tires over gravel. He passed a village, or what had once been one, a cluster of sagging wooden homes, shuttered windows, and a church whose steeple leaned like a drunkard clinging to dignity. There were no people, no cars, not even smoke from chimneys. It felt abandoned, though he couldn't be sure. He kept driving. The road narrowed, then widened again. The signs began to look newer, more official. The trees along the road had been trimmed back sharply, almost militarily. A fence emerged on the right side, high, taut with barbed wire at the top. No markings, no warnings. David checked his watch. Nearly 5 o'clock. He should have been back on the main road by now. He hadn't seen another car in over half an hour. He passed a small structure, half hidden behind trees. It looked like a checkpoint booth, abandoned or unmanned. A low chain hung across a side road, swaying slightly in the wind. That was when his gut tightened. He wasn't sure what exactly made him uneasy. Nothing had happened. There were no sirens, no soldiers, no shouting. And yet, the road dipped into a shallow valley and curved. That's when he saw it in the distance, low grey buildings, long and flat, hangars, barracks, a runway. And planes, military planes. David's breath hitched in his throat. He tapped the brake lightly, unsure whether to slow down or keep moving. A sign flashed past in Cyrillic script, then another in German. The second was unmistakable. Militärisches Sperrgebiet. Betreten verboten, military restricted zone, no entry. He had done it. He had gone off route. And now, unknowingly, he was deep in restricted territory. Panic bloomed, but he didn't stop, not yet. Stopping meant exposure. Movement still meant escape.
"Loop back," he whispered. "There has to be a way out. There always is."
But even as he said it, the certainty he clung to began to slip. The road so open just moments ago was starting to close in, not physically, but in his mind. The fences, the silence, the distant echo of boots against concrete. He wasn't supposed to be here. And someone, somewhere, would already know that he was. Chapter 6, The Turnaround. The moment David saw the runway, its endless strip of cracked concrete, lined with jet-black birds of war, he knew he had to turn around. His heart pounded a heavy, irregular rhythm in his chest, thudding like warning drums in a jungle he didn't understand. He eased off the accelerator and took a deep breath. The road was still clear. No flashing lights, no gates clanging shut, no shouting guards with rifles. Just wind through the trees and the metallic tick of the engine cooling ever so slightly.
"Calm down," he whispered, gripping the wheel. "No one's seen you. No harm done."
But his hands were slick with sweat. His stomach felt like a knot pulled too tight. He looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind him curved out of view, its edges blurred by trembling heat waves rising from the tarmac. He couldn't see anyone. That was either a blessing or a sign that he was already being watched. He slowed to a crawl, searching for a space wide enough to pull a U-turn. There were no intersections, no exits, just the narrow road and the encroaching trees. Finally, near a drainage ditch lined with gravel, he found a break wide enough. He checked his mirrors again. Still nothing. He turned the wheel hard and swung the Fiesta into a tight 3-point turn, the tires crunching loudly against the shoulder. as he maneuvered back in the direction he came from. Gravel popped under the wheels. The rear of the car slid slightly, and David's breath hitched. Then he was facing the other way.
Come on, just drive.
He accelerated gently, trying not to look like someone fleeing. But every nerve in his body screamed flight. The buildings grew smaller in his mirrors. He passed the Cyrillic sign again, this time reading it backwards, and felt a rush of relief. Too soon. Around the next bend, something changed. A dark figure stood at the edge of the road, partially hidden behind a tree. Just a flash, grey-green uniform, tall boots, gone as quickly as it appeared. David's throat tightened. Had it been a person? A trick of the light? A scarecrow? He didn't slow down to check. Further ahead, he thought he saw movement between the trees, noises he couldn't place, the sound of footsteps, or just wind in the leaves. He drove on, faster now, back toward the world he recognized. But the distance between recognition and trouble was shrinking rapidly. He passed the abandoned checkpoint booth again, only now, it didn't seem so abandoned. The chain across the side road had been lifted, or maybe it was never down. Either way, David didn't stop to inspect it. His goal was simple: get back onto a marked tourist road. Get back into the world where he belonged, where his currency worked and his smile didn't raise suspicion. But the country had shifted. It no longer felt like just geography. It felt like a labyrinth. Roads curved in ways that didn't match his map. Forests closed in where there had been fields. The logic of the land, once comforting, had turned hostile. Then, far in the distance, just beyond a gentle hill, he saw it. A road sign with a blue border. The tourist route. Relief washed through him like a warm tide. He would rejoin the designated path, blend back into the world of safe curiosity, and let this mistake dissolve into memory. But fate wasn't finished with him yet. Chapter 7, A Breath Too Soon. The blue-bordered sign stood like a lighthouse in fog, its clean lettering promising a return to the known. David didn't even need to read it to know. He was back on the official tourist route. His grip on the steering wheel loosened for the first time in an hour. The tension in his shoulders dissolved slowly, painfully, as if his body wasn't sure it had permission to relax.
Thank God, he murmured, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding.
The road now looked as it should, well-maintained, bordered by pedestrian paths and occasional signposts written in both German and English. He passed a touring bus with Western plates, its passengers peering out with cameras in hand, oblivious to the tightrope David had just walked. He laughed aloud, nervous, shaky, almost giddy. The laughter surprised him. Was it relief? Or hysteria, coiled from too many minutes of holding fear at bay? He drove for miles, skirting small towns and checkpoint stations, none of which took particular notice of him. No patrol cars behind. No lights. No shouting. The sun had begun to lower on the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the fields. In the growing dusk, the ugliness of the afternoon seemed to melt into the landscape. Perhaps it really had been a mistake. His, theirs, no one's. A wrong turn. Nothing more. In a quiet village with a fountain at its center, David stopped at a roadside inn to refuel, both himself and the car. The petrol station accepted his Westmarks with a subtle nod, and the clerk said little, save a quick
Guten Abend.
In the adjacent cafe, David sat at a table where he wasn't told to move. A small kindness, though the other diners still eyed him with quiet interest. He ordered goulash and rye bread and ate slowly, savoring it, not for the taste, but because he could eat it in peace. As night settled and the stars began to flicker above the treetops, David found a guest house and took a room for the night. The woman at the counter asked no questions. She took his papers, made a carbon copy, then handed him a key and pointed toward the stairs. The room was sparse but clean. A narrow bed, a writing desk, and a radio with dials that clicked with a satisfying firmness. David turned it on, tuned through the frequencies, landing on a station playing slow piano music, gentle, melancholic, Eastern, but timeless. He lay back on the bed, arms behind his head, and stared at the ceiling.
Close one, he whispered to no one.
Sleep came quickly, as it often does after adrenaline fades. But somewhere in his dreams, a chain rattled across a road, and boots crunched through gravel, and the hum of an engine died in the distance. And though David wouldn't know it until morning, his name was already being whispered behind locked office doors, his presence recorded, his detour noticed. He had escaped the scene. but not the consequence. Chapter 8. The Watcher at the Memorial. The morning broke with soft light and a chill that clung to the mist rising off the streets of East Berlin. David had planned to cross back into West Berlin by midday, but something tugged at him, a lingering curiosity, an unfinished feeling. After a quick breakfast of boiled eggs and bitter coffee at the guest house, he checked out and packed his things into the Fiesta. But instead of heading straight for the crossing, he steered the car deeper into the city, toward Treptower Park, home to one of the largest Soviet war memorials in the East. It was a place he had seen in books, massive stone figures, sweeping symmetrical design, and a towering statue of a Soviet soldier cradling a German child while crushing a swastika underfoot. It was meant to inspire awe, and it did, but it also exuded a cold finality that left little room for interpretation. David parked and walked through the wrought iron gates, his footsteps muffled by the gravel path beneath him. The park was mostly empty, save for a few maintenance workers sweeping leaves into orderly piles. A row of flagless poles lined the approach, and the granite walls seemed to breathe the echoes of history. He walked slowly, reading the engraved quotes, most in Russian, some in German. He imagined the Red Army soldiers who had died, who had marched into Berlin not just as liberators, but as a conquering force. The weight of it all was sobering. And that's when he noticed the boy. At first, he thought little of it. A child, perhaps 8 or 9, lingering near one of the stone columns. Dressed plainly, with a grey cap pulled low, and a jacket too large for his thin frame. But as David moved from monument to monument, pausing at the eternal flame and the row of sarcophagi carved with reliefs, he felt the boy's eyes. Always there, just outside his vision. When he turned, the boy would be staring. When he moved, the boy followed. Never close enough to speak. Never far enough to ignore. David's steps slowed.
"You all right, mate?" he called softly, attempting a friendly tone.
The boy didn't respond. He simply tilted his head, then looked away. David resumed walking, down the Grand Central axis toward the massive statue at the far end. The boy followed. No shoes scuffing gravel, no voice, no expression. Just presence. By the time David reached the foot of the colossal statue, his unease had returned full force. The air was still, too still. Even the trees surrounding the memorial seemed to hush themselves. He turned sharply, heart pounding. The boy was gone. David scanned the grounds. Nothing, no children, no shadows, just granite and silence. He lingered at the memorial a few minutes more, hoping to recover his calm. But the tension that had gripped him in the military zone now coiled again, subtler this time, but unmistakable. Something wasn't right. He didn't know what, he didn't know why, but he felt it in his skin, in his breath, in the way the world seemed to watch him, without moving. He left the park quickly, footsteps rapid now, gravel crunching louder than before. Back in the car, he shut the door with more force than necessary. His hands trembled slightly as he started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, he looked in the mirror once, then twice. No boy, but he couldn't shake the image, the blank stare, the silence, the following. It felt too precise, too staged, too deliberate. Chapter 9, The Wall of Waiting. The rain had come quickly, without drama, just a steady, soaking curtain that turned roads to rivers and the sky to steel. David wiped the fog from the inside of the windshield as he approached the border crossing into West Berlin. The watchtowers loomed again, concrete guardians of an invisible line. He felt the nerves return, but told himself there was nothing to fear. His papers were in order. He had spent no more than a few days behind the curtain. He had seen what he wanted, and now he would leave. But as he rolled up to the checkpoint, things changed. 2 guards stepped out, both young, one expressionless, the other stone-faced. They didn't gesture for papers. They didn't ask questions. One walked briskly to the driver's side and yanked the door open.
"Aussteigen, sofort!"
David's heart plunged. His mouth opened, but the words jammed in his throat.
What's going on?"
There was no explanation. A rough hand grabbed his arm, pulling him from the seat. The guard's grip was vice-like, and David stumbled as his feet hit the wet tarmac. Rain soaked through his jacket instantly. His documents fluttered from his lap to the floor of the car.
"An die Wand."
Another guard pointed toward a stained concrete section just beyond the checkpoint. David obeyed, his legs leaden, his mind whirling. He stood, face inches from the cold wall, the rain running down the back of his neck, collecting in his collar, soaking his trousers. His breath steamed in the frigid air. Behind him, boots paced, voices barked in German. A door slammed. And then the bus came. It rumbled past slowly, western plates gleaming through the haze. The windows were lined with faces, tourists, elderly men in safari hats, couples clutching guidebooks, a woman wearing oversized sunglasses and a startled expression. They all looked at him. Some stared with curiosity, others with pity, and one man even raised a camera before hesitating, lowering it again. No one waved. No one smiled. David felt the heat of shame bloom across his chest despite the cold. He had become a spectacle, a cautionary tale. He didn't know how long he stood there. 5 minutes? 15? Rain blurred time into something shapeless. Eventually, a pair of boots stopped behind him.
Diesen Weg.
David turned slowly, his face pale, hair plastered to his forehead. The guard gestured toward a squat grey building beside the crossing, its windows opaque with condensation. David walked, head down, aware now of every movement, every camera, every eye. The door opened with a shriek of rusted hinges, and David stepped inside, leaving the rain behind, only to enter something colder. Chapter 10. Under the light. The room was stark. Pale walls, a single bulb suspended from the ceiling, swaying gently as if disturbed by the tension itself. A metal desk stood in the center, flanked by 2 chairs, one occupied, the other waiting. The floor was linoleum, the kind that never quite felt clean. David stood dripping at the doorway. Rainwater pooled at his feet, and his breath came in shallow waves.
Setzen Sie sich.
The voice was calm, too calm. Its stillness was more threatening than a shout. The man behind the desk was middle-aged, dressed in the crisp olive-green uniform of the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the Ministry for State Security. The Stasi, his hair was clipped close, his eyes calculating. David sat slowly, water from his coat darkening the seat beneath him.
David Miller. Melbourne, Australia.
The officer opened a brown folder and removed a photograph. He slid it across the desk with 2 fingers. It was grainy but unmistakable, David's Ford Fiesta, parked near the military perimeter. His face, captured through the windshield. Another photo followed, David standing near the airbase fence, head turned as if sensing the camera. David swallowed hard.
You tell me, Mr. Miller, what exactly were you doing there? It was a mistake. I took a wrong turn. I thought it would loop back. You thought? The voice didn't rise. It didn't need to.
David hesitated.
You are an educated man. You read maps. You drove hundreds of kilometers to enter our sovereign territory. Alone. You carry a camera, and you expect us to believe that you simply became lost? Yes.
The officer leaned forward, folding his hands.
Do you think we are naive here in the East? That we do not notice men who watch airfields and slip from marked routes? That we do not have eyes on every road?
David opened his mouth, then closed it again. He couldn't argue, not convincingly. He had no defense but truth, and truth in this place was just another angle of suspicion.
What were you photographing? Architecture, streets, markets, just things I found interesting. You photographed soldiers, installations, the airfield. No, I didn't. I didn't know it was military.
The officer tapped a pen on the folder. Tick, tick, tick.
There are those in your country who would find such information valuable. Are you one of them? What? No, I'm a tourist.
The silence stretched.
You've had contact with locals. You've spoken to more than one East German citizen. Names? I didn't get names. I just talked casual conversation. There is no such thing here. You know this now.
David felt the sweat on his back despite the cold. His throat was tight, his limbs heavy.
What do you believe you've learned, Mr. Miller?
The question caught him off guard. The officer's tone shifted, not softer, but more curious.
I saw people living quietly, cautiously. I saw beauty, fear, dignity.
The officer tilted his head slightly.
Interesting.
Another photograph emerged. This one not of David, a child, blurred in motion, partially obscured by the statue at Treptower Park. The boy, David, stared at the image, heart skipping.
He watches too, just like us. You thought you were alone?
David said nothing. There was no right answer.
You will leave today, you will not return, and you will tell your people nothing of what you saw. Not in books, not in films, not in idle cafe conversations. Do you understand? Yes.
The officer gave a slow nod.
Go.
The door opened behind him. A guard waited. No more words were spoken. David stood, legs unsteady, and walked out. Chapter 11. The Crossing. The rain had thinned to a fine mist by the time David was escorted back to his car. The guard gave no instructions, no threats. He simply motioned to the vehicle with a curt nod, as though David knew the rest of the script. And he did. The engine started on the first turn, a mechanical mercy in a world that had shown him very few. David shifted into gear and eased forward. The final checkpoint was only 100 meters away, but each rotation of the tires felt deliberate, eternal. The barrier was down. A guard with a clipboard approached, this one older, with lines carved deep into his cheeks. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes flickered when he looked at David. Sympathy, maybe. Or exhaustion.
Documents.
David handed them over with a damp, trembling hand. The guard leafed through them slowly, too slowly. Every second stretched like taut string, ready to snap. Then, without a word, the guard stamped the passport.
Gute Weiterfahrt, safe onward journey.
He signaled to the boom gate. Rose. David exhaled, not relief, not yet, but something close. He eased the car forward, wheels passing over the last stretch of East German soil. The moment his tires crossed into the neutral zone, into that liminal strip between ideologies, he felt something in him crack open. And then came the West. Bright streetlights, billboard ads, buses with chatter and music spilling from open windows, graffiti scrawled in a dozen colors. The buzz of life returned all at once, like flipping a switch. The silence was gone. The watching eyes were gone. But they had left their mark. David pulled over just beyond the checkpoint and turned off the engine. He sat in silence, hands on the wheel, heart thudding with a rhythm he no longer trusted. In his rearview mirror, the border still loomed, its towers retreating into the mist behind him. But in his mind, they remained vivid, etched into memory like scars into stone. He had made it, but he would never again be the man who had first crossed into the East. Chapter 12. 2 Conversations. The cafe in Melbourne hadn't changed. The wooden chairs still wobbled at one leg. The overhead fan still clicked on every third rotation. The breeze outside carried the scent of eucalyptus and grilled meat from a nearby park. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that made the city glow with effortless comfort. David sat at the table with 3 friends, Rob, Tamara, and Chris, all gathered around chipped coffee mugs and the lazy murmur of familiar banter.
So, Rob said, leaning back in his chair, you finally survived your little adventure, eh? Still have both kidneys?
They laughed. David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes.
Yeah, survived.
What was it like? She asked, stirring her coffee slowly. You know, really?
It was intense, controlled, beautiful in some places, bleak in others. But it was the people, how they looked at you or didn't look at you, like they were waiting for something or afraid of something. Typical communism, I guess. Gray walls, gray people.
David shook his head gently.
No, that's the thing. It's not black and white, it's layered, it's psychological. You can't understand it until you feel it. The absence of trust, the fear that even a smile might be misunderstood.
There was a pause.
You get caught up in anything serious? Like, did the Stasi grab you or anything?
David nodded.
They did.
The table went quiet for a beat, then Rob chuckled.
No way. Really? What'd they do, strip you down and interrogate you like in the movies? Not exactly, but they watched everything. They knew where I'd been. They showed me photos of myself I didn't know had been taken.
He paused.
They showed me a photo of a boy who'd followed me in a war memorial.
Rob raised an eyebrow, unconvinced.
You sure it wasn't just a curious kid? I don't know, that's the thing. You never know. That's what gets under your skin.
Sounds creepy, I guess, but kind of romantic too, like Cold War spy stuff.
Bet you were never bored.
David looked down at his mug, the coffee untouched. The voices around him were warm, familiar, safe, but they felt far away. He had crossed a line, not just the Iron Curtain, but something deeper. And now he was back among people who hadn't. People who couldn't see the world through the same lens. People who didn't want to. He had lived through something that reshaped his understanding of freedom, of fear, of human resilience. To them, it was an anecdote. To him, it was a threshold he would never uncross. He smiled softly and raised his mug.
Yeah, never bored.
But as laughter resumed and someone changed the subject to weekend plans, David looked out the window. And somewhere, in the space between the noise, he remembered the silence of Treptower Park. Chapter 13. The Quiet Return. Summer in Melbourne had settled over Windsor, with its usual hum, trams clattering by, dogs barking in the alleys, the occasional shout from a pub down the block. David had resumed the rhythm of his old life. He worked freelance jobs, visited his parents on Sundays, and took long walks with no particular destination. But something had shifted. He no longer told his story unless asked, and even then, only in fragments. The full version, the one soaked in rain, silence, and suspicion, remained locked away, a chapter he wasn't sure how to open. One evening, after returning from dinner with his sister, David pushed open the door to his flat and felt something was wrong. Nothing was smashed, no windows broken, no drawers overturned, but something was missing. He checked the bookshelf first, his travel journals, photo album, the small cardboard box filled with ticket stubs, receipts, stamped border forms. Gone. Then the drawer in his bedroom. His passport, gone. Nothing else. Not the camera, not the cash, not the stereo, just the documentation of a journey now scrubbed from physical memory. David sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the space where the box had been. His first instinct was to call the police. But what would he say?
Yes, officer. Someone broke in and took my trip to East Germany.
He didn't call. He just sat there, listening, waiting for an explanation that never came. Maybe it had been a coincidence. Maybe it hadn't. He never saw the boy again, never heard from the East Germans. But he never renewed his passport either. And when his friends brought up travel plans, Berlin, Prague, even Moscow, he only smiled politely and said nothing. Some journeys are taken once, and some never truly end. Author's note: this story is based on actual events. For literary purposes, names and specific locations have been changed. While elements have been dramatized, the emotional and psychological experience of the journey and the lingering shadows it cast remain entirely true.